And to change their vertical positioning, I may have to use the Enter key on the keyboard a number of times in order to introduce some break tags or paragraph tags onto my web pages. But again, that's not the perfect solution. Now, what many of us have done in the past is to insert tables and use them in order to lay out our web pages. So I'm going to go to Layout, Insert Table from the menu, and then this allows me to select the number of rows and columns that I want to include within a new table that I'm going to introduce to my web page. I can also set things like the alignment, the border, cell padding, and cell spacing from here as well. I can even adjust individual cell properties if I wish to at this time, or I can select them individually and set them in the Properties window. I'm just going to click the OK button for now, and notice that it produces for me a 3x3 table into my web page. So I can drag and drop. For example, I'll put my text box there, I'll put my label in this cell, and then I'll take my OK button and I'll drag and drop it down to this cell. And then I'm going to run my application to see that I've got some more advanced layout control over my web page than I had previously. And this is certainly one option, and an option that most people take whenever they're designing their web pages, to use tables in order to do that. But there's also another option. Let me delete everything from here by just selecting it with my mouse cursor, then hitting the delete key on my keyboard, getting all the way up to the top. And I'm going to go to the Layout menu again. I'm going to go down to Position, and then go all the way down to the Auto Position options. I'm going to select this Change Positioning to the following for controls added when using the toolbox, paste, or drag and drop. And so at this point, I'm going to have absolutely positioned controls whenever I drag and drop them from the toolbox. I'm going to click the OK button now. So let's go ahead and try this again. I'm going to drag and drop the the button from the toolbox. And now notice that I can position it anywhere on the web page. Now, how is this accomplished? Let's take a look at the source view and notice that a style tag is now inserted into the definition for my button control, which gives me a z-index, which means, how are the controls overlapping, the left position, and the top position here kind of extends onto 2 lines, and that is positioned absolutely. Let's go back to our design view, and we can position a label as well. Now, when we drop it, it might place it over in the left-hand side, but we can drag it around and move it to its position. Let's go ahead and delete these 2 controls off and play around with our options just a little bit more. I'm going to switch back. Layout, Position, Auto Position options. I'm going to remove the checkbox from here and click OK, which puts us back into a relative position. We also have the option to insert what are called layers, and layers are absolutely positioned areas that we can introduce into a relatively positioned web page. So notice that I have relative position here, and I have absolutely positioned areas here, and within these areas I can drag and drop controls. So this is kind of an in-between solution where I can now reposition groups of relatively positioned controls within a relatively positioned web page. And yet there are still other options as well. I can, I believe, set each individual control and change it to be absolutely positioned. By actually selecting it and then going to the Layout menu one more time, going down to the Position submenu, and then selecting absolute for this single control. So there are my options for moving things around. Everything else is currently relatively positioned This one control now has been changed to be absolutely positioned. So while the emphasis between relative and absolute positioning, because I find this to be one thing that confuses developers when they think they're wanting to work with an absolutely positioned environment but only getting relatively positioned results. So hopefully this will answer one of the big question marks in your mind. And it really comes down to the source code that's added to each of the controls. When we relatively position that last button, as you see here is selected at the bottom, all it did was just add the style property and set some of its subproperties. The left, the position equals absolute, and top equals 113 pixels, and so on. The other two controls, the button and the text box, don't have those properties set. Okay, so enough about that. Let's go ahead and delete all these controls off, and let's move on from here. Okay, one more feature I wanted to show you before we move on is let's insert a table. We'll just set our 3x3 table. Okay, now say that I want to select a given cell in order to modify the features of that cell. What I can do is also use these little selection areas down at the bottom to select an individual cell or to select the content of the cell. Okay, so this gives me the ability to select an entire row at a time, the entire table, an individual cell, or just the content that's inside of a cell in order to modify its properties. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this as well. Just want to make you aware of that navigational ability that you have through this tag selector here at the bottom. Okay, now on to the fun stuff. I promised you that we were going to take a tour of some of the controls that are in the toolbox, so let's do that right now. First of all, for this example, what I want to do is go to the Layout menu one more time, go to Position, go to Auto Position Options, and then change the auto position to absolutely positioned, and click OK. So now everything we add to our form will be absolutely positioned. Okay, so for this example, what I want to do is just create a really simple little data entry interface that we might use on like our company's intranet, for example, where we allow a project manager to take a look at the various sub-projects that are going on and what the status of those projects are and what department that they're billable to and so forth, and allow our staff to enter their current statuses for various projects. Now we're going to make this very simple, so we won't make it too complicated. It'll give us a springboard in order to demonstrate some of the various controls that we'll come in contact with virtually every day while using Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition. So one of the first controls that we were able to use in our previous lesson were the label controls, and these are simply just textual labels with a programmatic interface like we used in the previous video. You'll recall to change the content of that label by setting its property equal to hello world or whatever the case might be. So in this case, let's change this to name, because we're going to use the labels this time as labels in the classic sense as we're building like Windows applications, right? We wanted to give the user some indication of what those controls that these labels are associated with will actually do. And the first control that we'll use is a text box control. And text boxes are simply to allow users to input any free-form kind of information, things that can't be predicted. So we allow alphanumeric characters to be entered here. I'm going to also change the name of, or the ID of our controls as we go along using a fairly new naming standard. We're going to, for example, in lowercase name, uppercase text box. Okay. And I think we've all seen text boxes before. It just allows for free-form input. Now, if we have a situation where we're trying to collect data where there's only a limited number of options, we might use something like a drop-down list box. So let's go ahead and position one of those on our form here. And we're going to name this status drop-down. And this is where we may want to only allow the user to select from a pre-selected or pre-entered number of options. So what we can do here is either we're going to click this little arrow in the upper right hand corner. You may have not seen this up to this point if you're just new to the Express Edition tools. But this gives us a list of quick tasks that are associated with that given control. And we can either data bind this particular control, which we're going to talk about in lessons, I believe, 7 and 8. Or for right now, we're going to hard code the options in by clicking the little Edit Items link in our Quick Tasks menu. And I'm going to select the Add button to enter our first list item. So the status will either be in progress or not started or complete. Or we might even choose select one as the first option, right? And we're going to set the selected option to true. So we want this by default, whenever the page loads up, to be the first option that's visible. And we might even just move it up to the top of the list. And then, in order to create the proper progression here, we may want to move this not started, this number 2, up ahead of the in progress. So I'll use these little arrow buttons to move each list item up and down the list. So now we have select one, not started, in progress, and complete. The select one list item has a selected option of true, so by default it'll be selected. I'm going to click the OK button. And then I'm going to click the little back arrow to close the quick tasks. Okay, so next we're going to use a series of radio buttons. And radio buttons are popular whenever you have like a true, false, or yes or no type question, or a limited number of options that are available to the user that are both visible at the same time. Now it differs from the drop-down list box in so much that the drop-down list box only allows us to it allows us to select from maybe 100, 200 different options, where the radio buttons, because of the amount of space that they take up, only allow us maybe to put 5, 6 within a group for selection. So understanding the propensities of each of the controls and then choosing the right controls for the situation can make all the difference when designing your forms. So in this case, we're going to change this to marketing radio button as the ID. And I'm going to change the text that appears next to the actual radio button by setting its text property. And we'll change this one to accounting. And we'll call this the accounting radio button. Okay. So now let's go ahead and test our application just to see how it works thus far. So I can select either marketing or accounting, right? Uh-oh, I have 2 selections here. What did I do wrong? Well, we can and we need to actually group these 2 together to let ASP.NET and the web browsers know that these are grouped together. So treat them as one or the other, but not both. And to do that, we will place them into a group. We'll call this group name department. So we have to make sure that both controls have their group name property set to department. Now let's try it this time. Now we've set that option. Let's see if it makes anything better. Okay, so now we can see a one or the other selection, but not both. Great. Now let's add a checkbox, and checkboxes are popular for whenever we need a yes/no type of question response from the user. So we're going to call this our approval checkbox. We're going to leave its check property to false, so by default it will not be checked. But we're going to change the text property to requires approval. And so let's test this now. So we can type anything in here, we can select something there, we can choose one of these, and then either click on or off requires approval. Great. Let's move on. We'll only use a couple more controls in this example, and then we'll probably use a lot more as we continue through this series of lessons. The next control I want to demonstrate is the use of the hyperlink, and we'll put this right next to this requires approval. And the hyperlink control is great whenever we want to dynamically change the link or the URL that a given hyperlink